to each other. And there is a stress on regional security and a prosperity-based and rules-based international order. So if you look at the 2+2 meeting that just concluded in Delhi yesterday, by 2+2, I mean the meeting of the defense and foreign ministers of India and the United States. So you had Secretary Pompeo and Secretary Esper in Delhi meeting with Defense Secretary Rajnath Singh, Defense Minister Rajnath Singh, and Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar. And they spoke of a shared vision for the Indo-Pacific. And the Indo-Pacific is a geopolitical term that has really gained ascendancy in the Trump years. And so today that region, which earlier, was blanketed under the Asia Pacific with India out of it because the Indian Ocean was not part of it, has now become really a confluence of the two oceans, India and the Pacific. So yesterday in Delhi, during the 2+2 meeting, they articulated, once again, I would say, a shared vision for an Indo-Pacific and global leadership mission that all countries in this region have a shared approach to. So the ministers, the US and the Indian ministers, talked about a commitment to a free, open, inclusive, peaceful, and prosperous Indo-Pacific. And I notice in the discussions that the United States has been having with Bangladesh, they add secure to it, a free, open, inclusive, peaceful, prosperous, and secure in Indo-Pacific. And again, they are talking of ASEAN centrality because we are next door to the Southeast Asian region where we are situated. And so we always talk of the centrality of Southeast Asia, of the ASEAN countries in this vision of the Indo-Pacific, rule of law, sustainable and transparent infrastructure investment, which is not exactly what the Chinese are doing with their development partners in the region. We stress freedom of navigation and mutual respect for sovereignty. And I think this is really a code word for the kind of aggression and muscularity that the Chinese have been displaying in the region, where you have territorial disputes. And India herself has seen how this works out when you have a dispute with a neighboring country, in our case, China. We have a 2,200 mile, approximately mile long border that we share with China. And it's a disputed border because there are disputes along this border which have not been settled, and the situation really flared up. We can talk about it perhaps in the discussion that follows. But what I want to stress is that during the Trump years, we've seen this contiguity and this closeness and this very sort of entrenched compatibility of views and vision and approach between India and the United States when it comes to this our region. The revival of the quadrilateral security dialogue after it had died a premature death in 2007. So now it's been reincarnated, as it were. We Hindus believe in reincarnation, and we have a quadrilateral dialogue. A well-known journalist in India recently called it in Hindi a Cheen Pirit dialogue. That means a dialogue among people who are troubled by China, though we don't say it, and it's perhaps not diplomatic to put it in such words. But in Tokyo, there was a meeting of the Quad earlier this month, and India, for the first time, also participated in the Five Eyes intelligent grouping meeting to talk about, and this includes the United States, Canada, UK, Australia, and New Zealand, to discuss law enforcement and encryption policies of companies like Apple and Facebook. So we've announced the expansion of the annual Malabar naval exercise to include Australia. Australia had been knocking on the door for some time. It had participated at one stage many years ago, and then dropped out because at that time, I think the equation between Australia and China was very, very different. But anyway, Australia is back now, and these exercises will be held in the Bay of Bengal, I believe, next month. So there is really an expansion of shared goals. Now, will this this quickening diplomatic dance, as it's called, how will it pan out if there is a change of administration, and if Vice President Biden is the winner of the presidential election? My view is that this relationship between India and the United States, particularly, is rock steady. It's a stable relationship, and if Mr. Biden becomes president, I expect a continuation of the very strong alignment of interests that you see between India and the US, both in the region and globally. Of course, Mr. Biden is expected to put his own stamp, his own style, and on this relationship. And he's spoken at length during the campaign about how he views the relationship with India and how he's going to approach issues like trade and immigration, and of course, and to take the relationship between our two democracies, the emphasis on democracy, an alliance of democracies. We don't use the word alliance very much in our diplomatic jargon here in India. We use terms like alignment, we speak of strategic autonomy, but there is virtually, I think, a much closer diplomatic dance between India and the United States. So it's really a very consequential relationship. And it's also a pole-proof relationship, as the international affairs, global affairs specialist Raja Mohan put it in an op-ed in the Indian Express just yesterday. So all this is happening against the background of a crisis with China. It's also happening against the background of a very strong presence that China is asserting in our region. And when we look at South Asia, which is essentially meant to be an integer, it's meant to be far more integrated in India and its 7 neighbors. We're 8 countries in South Asia. And the South Asian Association of Regional Cooperation has not fulfilled its potential. It's a case of promise denied in many ways. And we need much more integration, much more infrastructural connectivity, much more trade activity, much more people-to-people linkages. And that's really what is the vision for an integrated South Asia that I constantly stress, and in the work I do also outside the field of diplomacy. But China has become the dragon in the room as far as South Asia is concerned. It's much more of a visible presence, and it's making its impact felt economically, developmentally. People call this the age of implementation, and essentially China has proved itself to be extremely adept as far as making a difference in terms of its presence in the region. And that goes for Nepal, that goes for Bangladesh, that goes for Sri Lanka, that goes for Pakistan, that goes for the Maldives, not for Bhutan. Bhutan is a country that does not have diplomatic relations or linkages with China. It has an outstanding boundary dispute, as you know, with China, just as India has. And you're all aware of what happened on the Doklam Plateau in 2017. China and Pakistan are extremely close. They're the Iron Brothers, as they call themselves. Now, is a change of administration as a result of the US election going to make a difference in South Asia? Here again, I believe the approach and the determinant, basically, the determinant is essentially the China factor. And you've seen that with Secretary Pompeo going to Sri Lanka and traveling to the Maldives and then going to Indonesia. The US, and you had Deputy Secretary of State Biegun here in the region just a few days ago. There is a lot of work that the United States suddenly, it's activated itself in terms of reaching out to these countries. There's a defense cooperation agreement now with the Maldives, which India has also welcomed. With Sri Lanka, you're trying to do more on the Millennium Change Cooperation Initiative. And in terms of trying to get the message across to the region that, diplomacy is not all about running up debts with China, which is what has happened with a lot of these countries. And that for development to take place, you also have to look at transparency. You have to look at freeing yourself from too much of a debt burden. You have to function like, a rule-based international order is expected to function. And I think these countries do understand, but it's also a complicated situation. Take a country like Nepal, it has to achieve a balance, a geopolitical balance between China to the north, between India to the south, and if the United States were to come in, it's a classic three-body problem, I think, that all these countries are going to face. With Pakistan, the Trump administration, after a very rocky start, I think, because of the problems in Afghanistan and the need to come to a so-called settlement of the Afghan problem, has certainly felt the need for a greater role by Pakistan. I think I'm exceeding my 10 minutes at the moment, but let me say that the situation in Afghanistan is going to demand the attention of any new administration that is coming in. It's going to perhaps be the primary topic as far as South Asia is concerned in the next few months. And we'll have to see what the outcomes are going to be. So in short, the situation is complex. There is the China factor. There is a United States that sees, as it looks forward, a period of continued confrontation with China. And the impact of that is going to be felt all across our region. But the India-US relationship is in a good place and will continue to be in a good place. It is essentially a pole relationship. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Just masterful survey as always. In such a short amount of time, you took us through the region, and there's just so much to unpack there. Vipin, if I can turn it over to you, and one of the themes I was able to tease out from what Ambassador Rao just said is that, look, ultimately, at least with respect to India, irrespective of who wins next week, assuming we know the winner next week, we can expect continuity, right? That basically since at least the end of the Clinton years up until now, here in the US, we call it the so-called bipartisan consensus around the US-India relationship. It doesn't matter who occupies the White House, it doesn't matter who occupies the Prime Minister's residence or which party, that there's structural reasons why this relationship will continue to be on an upwards trajectory. You have a convergence of values, a convergence of interests, and for that reason alone, it's pull-proof. It's immune from the other vagaries externally that one can expect in other cases or with other countries when you have a change in power. If you can just start off by addressing that first, if you don't mind, especially just taking kind of the US side of this and then go from there, that would be great.
Great. Thanks, Ronak. Thanks to the Mittal Institute for hosting this. It's a real pleasure and honor to be back. I started my graduate career when the South Asia Institute was the South Asia Initiative, so it's great to see it flourishing. And, it's really not fair to have me follow Ambassador Rao, who I've long admired, who's not only an architect of the US-India relationship, but Indian foreign policy really over the last several decades. And she'll remember this, but she first appeared on graduate students' radars in, I think, must have been in 2002 when she was the MEA spokesperson. And she deadpanned in response to a series of Pakistan missile tests, "We are not impressed." And everybody who studied security in South Asia said this was, an impressive answer. And so we've known Ambassador Rao for a long time in the strategic community, and it's an honor to follow her here. So I agree with everything that she said and the outline of her remarks. So let me take a step back and talk a little bit about the structural features of this relationship that make it bipartisan, that make it long-standing. There's a tendency to look at the 2+2 and say, this is really something new, something that's unprecedented. But really, the U.S.-India relationship picked up in 2000 after the nadir of India's nuclear tests in 1998. I think U.S.-India relations were essentially at a rock bottom in 1998. The Clinton administration sanctioned India. But it only took 2 years for President Clinton to make a historic state visit to India. And every president since has gone to India. And the bipartisan consensus rests really on 4 major pillars. And I call them the 4 Ds. You'll have to forgive me. I had to squeeze some of the the terms into the Ds. But there's democracy, right? So there's shared values in democracy, defense, right? The fact that both are elevating the security partnership. For a long time, it was because of the centrality of India in the Indo-Pacific region, because of its geopolitical position, and it wasn't aimed at any one country. The U.S. had relations with a relationship with Pakistan, particularly after 9/11, and India had a relationship with China. But there was a natural defense relation security partnership between the two. There's the pillar of dollars, right? The trade relationship has improved. I think India and the US are now, including services, each other's largest trading partners. I mean, that's a huge improvement over the last several decades. And the last pillar is diaspora. Ronak, people like you and me, Indian Americans, both the immigrant stream and then first generation immigrants that have a natural tie to India that have elevated the partnership. And these are immutable. These are structural conditions that have made the partnership a bipartisan and bilateral, long-standing, set the two on a long-standing trajectory since 2000. And the highlight was probably, is often held up as the Indo-US nuclear deal, a signature, achievement of the George W. Bush administration, really, that after the nuclear tests, where India was on the outside of the nuclear weapons community, the Indo-US nuclear deal brought India into the mainstream nuclear fold and de facto recognized India as a legitimate nuclear weapons power. It was unprecedented what the United States was able to achieve with India in the Indo-US nuclear deal. But often what's forgotten is a lot of the details, that aren't as sexy as the Indo-US nuclear deal. So much is happening on the trade side, on the people-to-people side, on the defense side, that doesn't necessarily make headlines, but which is integral to the elevation of the partnership. And that has been, that has continued since the Clinton administration, the W administration, the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and whoever wins next week as well. And you see some of the fruits of that labor. The signing of the BECA agreement, one of the so-called foundational agreements yesterday, now allow India and US militaries to exchange geospatial intelligence, navigational data, and helps improve the exercises that have long been going on between India and the US, both in the Navy, the Air Force, and the Army. Tri-service exercises have started becoming more frequent. The Malabar exercises Ambassador Rao mentioned are long-standing. There's the inclusion of Australia this time after many years, but the foundational agreements. There's a myth that these will all of a sudden allow India and the United States to fight together. That's not entirely accurate. I mean, these are enabling agreements, and a lot of the contours have to be worked out. There's still agency as to what is shared, but the fundamental point is that the Indian and US militaries have been working on interoperability for a long time, and militaries that can operate together can fight together, and that's a really important elevation. From, in 2016, India was designated a major defense partner, which is kind of a bespoke term for India in the United States. It's not a NATO ally, it's not a Japan or South Korea, but it's designated a major defense partner, and it is a recognition of sort of the unique place that India holds outside of the formal alliance structure that the United States has as a major strategic partner. I mean, the phrase that defines the relationship now is, I think, comprehensive global strategic partnership, which is kind of a mouthful, but a rose by any other name would smell less sweet. And it really reflects, these major pillars on which the relationship rests. And that's not to say that there aren't points of friction. And I think it's important, to the reason why the United States and India are not formal allies is because each have interests that don't necessarily overlap. And that's important to recognize. And India has an approach that was previously characterized as strategic autonomy, and that may have slowed down some of the developments over the last decade, such as the signing of these foundational agreements. I think skeptics will say, well, it took 10 years to sign BECA. The optimist says, well, you still got there, right? And these points of friction, sometimes it's over immigration, it's over Harley Davidsons, it's over climate change, exist. And there's no need to obscure those. I think friends don't often always agree about everything, but it's important not to forget the major and enduring features over which India and the United States do agree. And dollars, defense, diaspora, and democracy are the four major pillars of that relationship. But it is important to note, and this is something that I want to focus on, Ambassador Rao mentioned, there has been an accelerant lately, right? A catalyst for, I think, a lot of the things that India in particular may have been hesitant about previously have sort of been left by the wayside because of China, right? So I think some hesitations on the Indian side were because India did not want to overtly be seen as entering into a deeper military partnership with the United States, because it wanted to at least engage China in some ways, to borrow a phrase from somebody I just plagiarized from, and I can't remember who said it. But there's China is India's neighbor, and in terms of vertical supply chain ingredients and dependencies for pharmaceuticals, electronics, China is sort of an unavoidable partner. And it's perfectly understandable from a realist perspective why India would want to at least maintain a vibrant trading and political relationship with China. But the fact is, after Doklam, China has become more aggressive. And this year has, whether we want to overtly admit it or not, taken bites out of claimed Indian territory. And it may be that, one can, exploit the ambiguities around the line of actual control and what has precisely happened. We don't understand the ground situation precisely. But the fact is that China has taken pieces of territory that it did not occupy before, that India believed was its own. And this has, I think, sort of clarified for India, and was already clarifying for the United States, that, maybe a deeper security partnership with the United States was something that China was going to assume anyway. So why not just dispense with the facades and some of the niceties and accelerate what was going to happen anyway? And I think China has Chinese behavior, particularly towards India and Ladakh and along the LAC, has accelerated some of these developments in ways that have clarified both for India, but also the United States, that this partnership can be deepened in ways that are beneficial and in both countries' interests. That said, structurally, regardless of who wins next week, there's still limits as to what India can do on a number of dimensions. One, China is still India's neighbor and is still a large trading partner, and India is still dependent on active pharmaceutical ingredients, APIs, into a lot of India's own pharmaceutical industry, electronics, broader trade, and it still has to deal with the fact that China is a neighborhood and an Asian actor. And so there are limits as to what India may be willing to do, and the US has to at least appreciate or accept that. But there's also kind of this other actor in the room, which is Russia. And on the defense side, at least, which is the area that I study most closely, it is an inescapable fact that the Indian military is a Russian military. All of the frontline equipment, from the Sukhois and the MiGs in the Air Force, to the T-90 series in the Army, the tanks, to the naval reactors with the Indian Navy, are Russian provenance, if not outright Russian. And the Indian military cannot turn on a dime. And it needs maintenance and spares, and it needs operations, and it needs further replacements from Russia for all of that equipment. And it's not going to happen overnight, which means India is inescapably dependent on Russia. And that creates some problems for the defense relationship. India is going ahead with the purchase of the S-400 air defense missile defense system. And there is this issue about CATSA, the congressional legislation on Russia for parties that purchase significant Russian equipment. And the S-400 is significant because the United States does not necessarily want its mainline, equipment, F-16s, F-18s operating in the same space as the S-400, because it can give the Russians data on US equipment. And interoperability, India has this problem already about operating a military with so many different suppliers. The reality is that its primary supplier is Russia. And that limits how much maneuvering room India has on the defense side with the United States. There's certain equipment that the US may be reluctant to provide. There may be certain data that the US is reluctant to provide, so long as India is, and it inescapably is for the next several decades, primarily Russian military. Now, that doesn't mean that there can't be a very significant and deep cooperation with India on the defense side. I mean, the United States has operated with Russian supplied militaries in the past, such as Egypt, but that does impose upper limits and a ceiling on the relationship. The other big structural impediment, which will have, I think, big implications for who wins next week, is India's economy, right? So one of the attractiveness of India for the United States since 2000 has been liberalization, India's rising economy. Well, the pandemic has put a dent in India's economic rise. And this year is going to be very, very bleak for India's economic growth numbers. And recovering that economy is going to be India's largest challenge, because a weaker India, as Ashley Tellis has said, is a less attractive India for the United States as a partner in the defense relationship. So, an India that can't buy ships can't operate and exercise and improve cooperation with the United States in the Indo-Pacific. And so if India's economy continues to decline, it's possible that a Trump administration won't care, will overlook what the Democrats have focused on in the past a little bit more, which is the perceived declining liberalism in India, right? The democratic pillar. The Trump administration has overlooked that for the most part, has been very quiet about it. It is not clear to me, and it's not a foregone conclusion that a Biden administration would. And there are elements within the Democratic Party, for example, that are very concerned about the domestic legislation in Kashmir, the detention of legitimate opposition leaders, and that was raised by people who will populate a Biden administration when they're in Congress. And Ashley Tellis has also said, that this may be an increasing point of friction if India's economy opens the space for a Democratic administration to focus more, which focuses more on human rights and values, to potentially raise red flags about that if that continues in India. And so there may be this variation if India's structural position and its declining economy persists, where a Biden administration may focus more on the democracy pillar than a Trump administration would. And so there may be an impact depending on who wins the election. But I think that's variation on the theme. I think the broad theme will persist. India is a valuable partner of the United States. The four pillars persist. It's not as if the United States is in a position, especially now, to talk about declining liberalism in any country. So there are those in glass houses sometimes shouldn't throw stones. But there are, these enduring features that have led to an elevated partnership, I think will persist regardless of who wins. And there may be some variation on the theme. I will say that I think the real indicator, we're still in the phase where a 2+2 meeting and ministerial meeting is treated sort of like Diwali. It's an exciting and headline raising event. I think a real indicator for when the relationship has made it is when those are so routine that they aren't on the front page of the newspaper. And I think that's what will be a really strong indicator that the partnership has moved beyond theatrics into something that is so routinized and so deep that we don't even think about it anymore, like we do with Japan or South Korea. When a Japanese or South Korean minister visits the United States or vice versa, it's so routine that it doesn't make the headlines or front page news. And I think, that's kind of where the relationship is headed. And I look forward to the day that that's sort of what the relationship looks like. So I'll stop there and turn over to you, Ronak, and to questions and answers from the audience. Thank you.
No, thanks so much, Vipin. And again, just so insightful as always. And you brought up a number of topics that I want to explore. I'm very mindful of the fact that so far most of our discussion has focused on India. I want to make that discussion a bit more panoramic. And before I do that, though, there were a few points that you and Ambassador Rao both hit on substantively and both thematically. What I find striking, right, this idea that there will likely be continuity, there is this bipartisan consensus, and ultimately, we can expect a lot of the same to move forward, given you have these structural, the 4Ds as you call them, and these other factors, embedded within the relationship. I mean, I think the one of the areas that sets Trump apart, which is why I'm focused on differences here for a second, is that Trump comes in And just like a lot of his predecessors, he spent the first couple of years trying to strike a deal with China, trying to have a friendly orientation to China. If you remember, during the early Obama years, they talked about a G2, which provoked a lot of outrage in Delhi. And this seems to be a very familiar pattern, right? Where the US will try to engage Chinese leadership, they try to strike all sorts of bargains and pronouncements, and that ultimately fails. And I think Trump went in with a similar expectation, but learned very quickly that that wasn't going to work. What I feel sets him apart from his predecessors, and what may set him apart from a potential Biden administration, which has profound implications for folks in South Asia, is he's made the US position on China very clear. Any ambiguity that existed with respect to how they view China, what their posture toward China is, I think has been clarified to a hilt. And if you even look at Secretary Pompeo's remarks in Delhi, in Sri Lanka, what he's likely to say in the Maldives, the Chinese Communist Party is followed by a litany of accusations. And we've talked about the 2+2, and Vipin, you and Ambassador Rao both talked about, on the one hand, the Quad is going through this resurgence. It also seems as if China's become the dragon in the room that folks are willing to talk more openly about. Have the Chinese inadvertently or not pushed the Indians perhaps more closely to the Americans? But what I found striking yesterday is if you compare what Secretary Pompeo was saying about China versus what Minister Jaishankar was saying, it was quite the contrast. Jaishankar, I think, was very careful he didn't mention China expressly. I thought his comments in that regard were almost a little bit more bland, right? He very clearly wanted to make sure he was not going to say something that was going to box India in. They're not willing at this point, from what it looks like, to really go much further, at least in terms of the rhetoric, that would somehow foreclose the possibility of a resolution, a settlement of some kind, even in the short to medium term. And the reason I bring that up is if Trump has taken this posture, and again, it might in off-the-record conversations in capitals around South Asia be welcome. If a Biden administration comes in, this question, I think, will resurface again. Will you see the Biden folks try to engage China constructively? Will there be elements of both competition and cooperation? How should countries in that region prepare for that, for example, right? If that is in fact the case. If Trump is quite clear on where he is, I think the Biden folks will bring in a degree of nuance, perhaps, that isn't so express than what we've seen over the past 2.5 years. That's one, and I'll have you both comment on that here in a second. The second thing I wanted to also just discuss is I was waiting to see how long it took for Kashmir to be brought up. And I think if this conversation had taken place 6 months ago or 8 months ago, it would have been brought up much more quickly and at the forefront. What's been very interesting to me, I think the Chinese did a great service to India with respect to the Kashmir issue in terms of international fora, where the US is willing to manage a lot of the domestic issues in India, willing to perhaps overlook it, willing to perhaps approach it with the degree, again, of nuance that otherwise wouldn't have existed, because the China question has once again emerged at the forefront. And if we talk to Ashley Tellis, he'll tell you, look, ultimately China and the rise of China, the unknown nature of the rise of China was one of the reasons that brought these two countries together. It's why the Bush administration took such a heavy strategic bet on India. And what greater reminder than to see 20 Indian soldiers murdered on the border with clubs and with nails and so on and so forth. So even in Sri Lanka, for example, right, this debate's taking place there in a different way. Has the US been more willing to overlook the D component, the democracy component, in a country like in Sri Lanka, where there might be some backsliding based on what's happening in the country internally, where human rights issues with respect to the Civil War that were at the forefront of that relationship even 6 or 7 years ago don't seem to be as important, right? Has the China factor as a result ultimately overtaken other considerations that are weighed to be relatively less important than the security, defense, and other ones that we're seeing right now? And Ambassador Rao, if you can start us off, that'd be great.
Okay, let me try and tackle
yes.
the issues that you raised. Well, I think, if you're talking about how a Biden administration is going to deal with the China factor. I think the term that Vipin used about congagement, I think would definitely apply. I believe, yes, if you look at the Obama-Biden years and the manner in which China was engaged with, you would perhaps assume that some of that would continue to guide a Biden administration if that were to be the outcome of the elections next week. But I'm not sure that if it's going to be exactly like that, because when you talk of bipartisan consensus regarding India, there is, of course, a very, very now entrenched bipartisan consensus within the United States and across the popular spectrum about China, about the threat from China, about the way China has shortchanged the United States, and about the death of engagement with China. So even Mr. Biden has used rather, negative terms like calling China a thug, for instance, in one of the debates. So I don't believe that the approach to China will be vanilla anymore. I think it may not be as strident and as in your face as how Secretary Pompeo refers to China and the Chinese Communist Party, and he insists on calling President Xi Jinping General Secretary Xi Jinping. So it's become very ideological. I'm not so sure to what extent the ideological factor will define the approach to China, but it will be defined a lot by the outcomes that we are now able to perceive with the benefit of hindsight about the steps that the United States took in regard to bringing China into the global fold, and how how that had failed. I mean, there is a failure at the heart of all that happened vis-a-vis China, because ultimately China did not play by the rule book by and large. And China has an approach to the global order that is essentially very different from the kind of structures that we built in the post-war period, and which essentially all the world has subscribed to these years, and especially after the fall of the Soviet Union. And we assumed that that would be the end of history, but that has not happened. So the whole Chinese approach to building a world order that is more conducive and compatible to their own image of how stability is to be defined, and how governance is to be defined, and how diversity is to be dealt with. All that is essentially conflictual when it comes to the principles that we define as composing the world order today. So I don't believe it'll be easy for Mr. Biden, if he becomes the president, to approach China in a way that is tangentially different from how the Trump years have, defined the approach to China. And I think you have to give Mr. Trump that credit when he really tore the veils off China and was able to expose it for what it is. And I think most of the world sees that threat today. There's a complete diminution of trust, the trust factor, when it comes to China. So I believe that a Biden administration, for all its emphasis on, dealing with China and trying to be able to persuade and convince China to play by the rules, I don't think that's really going to work. So you are going to see difficult times between China and the United States, and that has an impact on the rest of the world and on all of us who are also seeing this very forbidding and also negative face of China today. As far as the Kashmir issue is concerned, I again, when I think of the United States-India relationship, like Vipin spoke of the 4 Ds, I would speak of the 4 Cs. There's continuity, there's consensus, there's cooperation, and there's compatibility. And I believe that when it comes to the US and China, even US and India, even under a Biden administration, these factors will kind of undergird the relationship. So if it's an issue of human rights, or if it's an issue of liberal democratic society and the way the rules should apply to societies such as ours, And maybe there will be private discussions, face-to-face, one-to-one, or within an official, network. Perhaps views will be exchanged on such issues. Congress, some members of Congress may speak against what is happening there. But I believe, by and large, the overarching interests of this relationship and the strategic outlook towards the Indo-Pacific, all these factors, and the fact that India is a large democracy, it is a large, burgeoning economy with great potential. There's a lot of business that the United States can do with India, especially after, the China relationship seems to be self-destructing. The whole question of building up closer economic ties and building up India's strengths in the region, I think, will be a priority of the United States. And therefore, issues like Kashmir, I don't believe will be deal breakers or very, very deep irritants in the relationship. Thank you.
Vipin, anything to add? Look, I think that's right on. And my view on this is, if Kashmir may have been an issue months ago, even if a President Biden comes into power in January of next year, it simply won't be a factor in American decision-making with respect to India, or at least not a major factor.
Yeah,
and while this may be an issue of style over substance, look, it's one thing to have President Trump in India earlier this year, violence breaks out in Delhi, which appears to have had a communal component, and he doesn't say a word, right? And ultimately he says that's India's business. That's one thing. And I think what you said in terms of would, a Biden administration be as silent on something like that as a Trump would be, perhaps not. But would it, in terms of change the overall calculus, change the overall structure, change the overall arrangement between the two countries on so many other foundational issues? My view is most likely not, especially given other threats and other interests that have emerged, which once again have reminded the two countries of why they are so-called natural partners.
Yeah, I agree completely with that. I don't think anyone's going to hold the relationship hostage due to domestic political factors in the other country. And I also, the thing that will threaten, I think there are two major threats to the long-term, I think, continuity in the trajectory. One is if India's economy can't get itself together. I think that is a real concern. I think, part of the attraction of India as a defense and trading partner is its growing potential in Asia as an economic and military heavyweight. And so that is really important. I just, in terms of the contribution India can make to that partnership, if it has to focus inwardly because its economy is not able to recover at the rate that Delhi may want it to, then that can have impact on this on the structural features of the relationship. The other thing is, and I think this is important, a lot of the threats to the relationship have been in the past, I think, overinflated expectations. Yeah. The India-US relationship performs best when things are quiet, happening behind closed doors, and there isn't hype around and overinflated expectations around the relationship. India is not going to become like Japan. India is not going to be a NATO ally, and we shouldn't think of it that way. India doesn't want it. It's not necessary. And the United States doesn't approach relationships like that anymore. And so when you hear, I think there's a tendency in both capitals to sort of, talk about an elevation of the relationship to unrealistic levels. And I think when you set the expectations high, I'm a born pessimist. So I always say, keep expectations low and beat them. Don't set them high and always fall short. And so, my own... You're
just an Indian son, Vipin, that's all.
Maybe that's exactly right. My parents used to set them up here, right? So my mom is still upset I didn't go to medical school. This is how. So there's, I do think that the relationship performs best when the expectations are kept realistic. And a lot of these conversations are held in private, or, there isn't a lot of fanfare around it, right? I think the relationship that is in the headlines all the time is one that is kind of at risk of, failing to meet expectations. And so the structural features are going to continue. And there's no reason, India will have to get it all. The entire world has to get the economies back going. But I think, India may face challenges there that other countries as a developing nation, don't face. So, that is a big that is a big challenge for India. But I also think, being very clear-headed in both capitals about what the relationship is about and what it isn't, I think is actually to the benefit of the relationship. So everything else I think won't hold, is not a real threat to the relationship.
And I think,
there were 2 points that I thought I'd add here. On the issue of Kashmir, everybody talks about the phase in the Clinton administration when, Kashmir was spoken about. People I notice in some webinars are bringing up the example of Robin Rayful. I don't believe that situation will duplicate itself or replicate itself today, because the relationship between India and the United States is in such a different place. And even if the Indian economy is not doing so well, and take some time to recover, I do hope that won't be the situation. I just believe the place the relationship is in today, and the way India has changed and the way it's grown and the way it counts in this region as a force for stability and for partnership, for strengthening of a partnership between our two countries. I think that is going to be the governing factor. That is going to be the do or die kind of factor. And as far as the economy is concerned, now, if Mr. Biden were to be elected and he's going to engage in more fiscal spending, and there may be a weakening of the US dollar, that may actually help Indian markets, and also less of an intense pressure, or less intense pressure on China on the trade front. Just suppose that Biden decides to lower the tariffs or try to come to some terms with China on that. That may help Indian markets as well, although it may not really help our efforts to build more manufacturing as a replacement for China, and on the whole question of resilience of supply chains also. But let's see how things turn out. But the world is a very different place today, and I think the overriding factor is the China-US competition. Even if there is no war, I think there are very, very turbulent times ahead.
Yeah, and I was just going to add, look, I think the US and India in that regard are somewhat in the same position, right? As important as these bilateral ties are, and as important as these relationships are, even within a larger constellation of South Asia, the US is also going to be dealing with a number of formidable internal challenges, irrespective of who wins next week, right? And India is going through its own internal obstacles, and I think that will most likely take priority and, to a certain extent, really shape what engagement's going to look like, at least in the short term. Just to wrap up the China conversation, we've gotten a number of questions here that more or less track the same way, and the question here is, given China's various initiatives in the region and beyond, whether it is Belt and Road, maritime, whether it's what we call debt trap diplomacy. What can these two countries do, the US and India, to help manage Chinese actions in a manner, if I can just paraphrase, in a manner that won't further exacerbate tensions, right? We talk about the classic Thucydides trap, are you taking actions that are making, your potential adversary more insecure, which leads to an escalation. What can and should these two countries be doing beyond what they've already done to help manage, Chinese actions or Chinese revisionist actions in the region and beyond, in a manner that's responsible and still can lead to, a more secure global architecture? And Vipin, if you want to start us off.
Yeah, so I wanted to add just one thing on the India-US relationship. One advantage that if Vice President Biden wins next week, one huge advantage he has is he doesn't have to do a huge repair in the way that he would have to do with Europe and Asia, because President Trump has so disrupted American relations with almost every other country. Our closest, in fact, it is better to be, outside of America's formal alliance structure right now, because, if you're Germany and, continental Europe, there's a lot of repairing to be done. But President Trump, India has been one of, in terms of continuity and just in terms of foreign policy, it has been one of President Trump's bright spots. And that gives the vice president or a Trump too a huge advantage. You don't have to do a huge repair. There isn't a concern, that even under President Trump, the U.S. stayed the course with India, and so that's a huge advantage no matter who wins. And that actually, I think, is a testament, a surprising testament to the relationship. I think if you had asked me, given President Trump's own, somewhat, racist proclivities, whether that would have happened. I don't think in 2016 it was a foregone conclusion, but it did, and that was, a big bright spot. Now, on the China question, it's a very good question because, in international relations theory, we have, from Bob Jervis, this deterrence versus spiral model, and the U.S. and India, I think, want to bolster deterrence against China, but China gets a vote, and it is not clear to me that China will see anything that the US and India or the US does with anybody else, which may be intended for deterrence purposes, as anything but spiral.
Right.
And we may be there. I'm actually increasingly convinced that there is no deterrence model. We're always in a spiral world. And that has huge implications, I think, for the United States in particular, but also for America's partners in the Indo-Pacific region. And there should be no illusions that these deepening partnerships are going to be viewed either instrumentally, and I think largely instrumentally, by China as sort of a self-encirclement midst of empire, development. And they will use it, Xi Jinping may use it to rally around the flag. Look at what the US is doing with all of our neighbors. They're encircling us, right? Even if it's self-encircling, which it seems to be. I mean, China is the one who took bites out of India's territory. China is the one who's behaving the way it is in the South China Sea and Hong Kong. And it is the revisionist power. But the narrative in China will easily be, you can already see it happening. If India and the US deepen their partnership, this is provocative against China. So I'm not sure if there's a way around this. And, that has real implications for how the relationship should be viewed and thought of, right? So we should have no illusions that these are going to be viewed as defensive in nature. The Chinese are going to view this as provocative, and we should adjust accordingly.
When it comes to the region, we don't want asymmetric multipolarity. We would like a more balanced multipolarity. And I think that is really what I hope the United States and India set out to do when even as you build the Quad and you try and enlarge the scope of its activities to look beyond defense and security into development cooperation, technology-related activity, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, infrastructure, connectivity, and building more dialogue mechanisms with other countries in the region who all have a problem with China. They may not speak out against it so much. In Southeast Asia, certainly, I think they're hedging their bets. They're trying to, follow the middle way, as it were. But they have their problems with China, and I think they need some reassurance on that count. And as far as our South Asian neighbors are concerned, bar Pakistan, which of course is another subset altogether, I think they're also striving for that kind of balance. It's not, what the question is, what can Washington and New Delhi do to further their interests, especially in the light of China's Maritime Silk Road and Belt and Road Initiative? How do you combat Chinese influence in the IOR? Now, China has set out to become, a naval power. Every country in this world which has become a global power through history has built a huge navy, a powerful navy for itself. And that is really what China has set out to do. It's not yet a powerful presence in the Indian Ocean, but its reach is being extended, especially, the buildup of its presence in Djibouti, which is essentially a logistic facility. But I believe they've built a huge jetty there, which can accommodate an aircraft carrier if it were to berth there. And what it does in Gwadar, the port it has built in Pakistan at Pakistani request, as history tells us. But today, of course, it's there for the Chinese. It's their outlet to the Arabian Sea. Similarly, their relations with Bangladesh and Myanmar are essentially building them that reach and that access. Also with Sri Lanka, the port of Hambantota, on which they have a 99-year lease. So there is a possibility for a pivot really to take place in these areas. I mean, China is taking out sort of insurance policies, as it were, to build a presence for itself in the region, which it can then augment. So we have to be alert to all this, and I believe that the partnerships that India, the United States, democracies like Japan, we didn't talk about Japan, but Japan is really going to play a key role also in building this architecture for the Indo-Pacific, which is more transparent and inclusive and rules-based. But I think the cooperation that we need to focus on must, of course, be defense and security. It must include interoperability, but it has also to look to the interests of all these countries in the region and how they perceive the China threat and how they would like more of a balanced multipolarity.
It is remarkable, I must say, that only 18 months removed from Pulwama and Balako, we're not talking about Pakistan at all. And China has done this essentially, on its own. And I think that's for Washington, this is the conversation that it's wanted to have, and the clarity from India that it's wanted. And for India, I think it also provides clarity as to who its primary threat is in the region. And we're only 18 months removed from that, and the fact that
that's right,
it's kind of on the sideline it's a remarkable feature.
Yes.
No,
exactly.
Absolutely. And we've got a few minutes left. I want to slightly shift gears a little bit because we've gotten a number of questions on diaspora. This is something that you've both mentioned in your respective remarks. I do think that the diaspora has always been a factor in the relationship. And we can talk about the Indian American diaspora. We can talk about the South Asian American diaspora. I know these taxonomies are loaded themselves, but I think especially what we've seen in the last just few months is that the community here in the US has garnered more attention, both as a voting bloc and both in terms of its role in growing public service, that it hasn't before. Obviously, Senator Harris's ascension on the ticket has further amplified that. And just a couple of weeks ago, I know Devesh Kapoor and Millen and others came out with this just really great study and numbers, right? That's something we always look for, are assertions supported by hard facts and numbers, where they said, look, there is a partisan dimension to diaspora. But one of the most striking features of that study that was published is that US-India ties actually don't rank very high in terms of the set of issues that Indian American voters find important. And at least anecdotally, this was a surprise to me, right? I remember as a kid growing up in Southern California, you get all these members from the SoCal delegation showing up at the India Day Independence Parade on August 15th and saying, my wife loves wearing saris. I love samosas. We'll never sell F-16s to Pakistan. And that was kind of it. And, you would talk to folks from my parents' generation where this was the real issue of, Pakistan's nefarious behavior or Chinese designs. This study says that's not the case. We saw during the US Civ nuke deal, which we were all involved with in different capacities, of how the diaspora, in a way, on the one hand, was claimed came to maturation, right? That it was operationalized in a way to India's benefit. If you could just both give me some thoughts, and I know, Ambassador, from the Indian side of how the diaspora is seen, and I know Prime Minister Modi has really made a conscientious effort to do diaspora engagement. I mean, it was such a central feature of his early foreign policy conduct. I think, that would be helpful. And Vipin, if we can talk about the domestic factor here a little bit, right? This idea that has the community come to age? If you are members of the diaspora that care about the partnership, what can you do to again, help be a custodian effectively and further move that partnership forward? So Ambassador Rao, if I can hand it over to you.
Well, Ronak, I think from India, from here in India, we're very proud, really, of the Indian American diaspora and just the successes that it has notched, over the years, and how it has entered the American, the mainstream of American life. I mean, I personally have always felt that while the diaspora obviously needs to focus on issues back home, and they have been of great help to us, when it's come to legislations that have really affected the course of India-US relations, their role and their contribution can never be minimized and needs to be celebrated, no doubt. But when you talk about, the study that Devesh and Milan and others had done, on Indian American attitudes, and when they found that the US-India relationship did not rank as high as we assumed it would do in priorities that they have when deciding for whom to vote. I mean, that's not, I think in a way it's natural, because they become American, especially the second generation, the third generation. I've always felt that, they've become almost 100% American, although they're ethnically Indian, which is, I think, a good thing, because they bring so much of, their skills, their successes, their dedication, their diligence to improving, American society and adding value to it. So I believe that is a contribution that India, in a way, sitting here, I feel we should be proud to have made. We will, of course, encounter different attitudes. I mean, I know the problems that occurred when the issue of Kashmir was raised by certain Democratic members of Congress, and how that, really riled the government in Delhi. That sort of thing, I'm sure, is not going to go away entirely. But by and large, I believe when it comes to the diaspora, I agree with Vipin that they are one of the major pillars of this relationship, and they should continue to be that way, to be more visible. Now you have Kamala Harris; she's part Indian American, visible in the mainstream of American life, and because that really means that India has arrived in the United States.
Yeah, on the domestic side, it is interesting. I do think that because there's a bipartisan consensus for a stronger India-US partnership, that washes out in terms of voting preference. So it's not that I don't think it's not important for a lot of Indian Americans, especially those that have naturalized. I just think because both parties are basically in the same place, then what their party ID is sort of determined by either their pocketbook or, liberal democratic values if they're Democrats, right? So what's interesting to me, though, is actually once the foreign policy bit washes out, the percent of Indians, I think Milind and Devesh and the UPenn graduate student, Sumitra Bhadra Kumar, I think is was one of the lead authors. It's 72% of Indian Americans identified as Democratic, which is the highest of any minority. And that's against their pocketbook interests in a lot of cases, which shows how much the values piece matters, I think. And it raises these interesting questions. They surface this in the report, right? How much, the split on the approval for Prime Minister Modi is much more even. It's not, those who supported Vice President Biden, for example, or identified as Democrats, had lower approval ratings for Prime Minister Modi, but it didn't affect their view of the relationship itself, or where India-US relations ranked in their preference ordering. And so I think, like all things, identity and diasporically related is complicated. And the diaspora does a couple of things for the relationship. One, it enhances India's soft power. Everybody in America has seen Mindy Kaling and Hassan Minhaj in the mainstream. They've been to Indian doctors. Indian food is mainstream. Trader Joe's in the snack aisle is selling, of all things, pumpkin spice samosas now. I mean, this has elevated the place of India in American culture. And that is really important, I think, right? We can't underestimate why and how it has become a pillar of the relationship. But the Indian American community, as Ambassador Rao suggested, it can get complicated, right? So that soft power is great in the successes, in professional American life, in Silicon Valley. But, Representative Jayapal crossed a line as far as the government of India was concerned, right? It gets complicated if someone from the Indian diaspora then criticizes India. And I think that raises all sort of complexities and issues that are actually probably going to become more difficult going forward as more Indian Americans occupy positions of political power or advisors in a Biden or a Trump administration. Both administrations have lots of Indian Americans. Now, a lot of them don't advise, and maybe this is for the better, that Indian Americans don't advise on India itself. I think that is something that, it's been complicated in the past, and some, Ashley Tellis has transcended it. Rich Verma has transcended it. But it is very complicated. And that's something, that I think bears watching, right? So those challenges aren't going to go away. It is complicated, but it is also a fundamental pillar of the relationship. So the Indian American diaspora, whether they lean Democrat or Republican, probably doesn't matter as far as the government of India is concerned in a broader sense, because it does help elevate India's broader soft power in America. And I think if you, I don't know if this has been done. I'm sure somebody has polled on it, but if you do like a thermometer feeling of India amongst the general American population, I imagine it is exceptionally high, that there are generally positive feelings towards India. And a lot of that is because of the diaspora. And I think that that's really important to remember. And that helps elevate the strategic partnership also. That's what makes it a bipartisan consent. There aren't very, very strong lobby groups against better India-US relations.
Yeah, and look, India is in a very unique and I think advantageous position where both parties are trying to prove that they're better for the relationship than the other. I mean, there's no other country that I can think of where that's the case. And even with Howdy Modi and I was there backstage, I mean, the idea that that kind of event could be organized for another leader just defies one's imagination, right? That's something that's so uniquely again, favorable to the bilateral. I mean, one thing that I will say just in closing here is, I think about the diaspora, and ultimately when I read Divish and Milan's work and kind of see how the diaspora's role has changed over just the past 5 to 7 years, I think we can draw a few conclusions, right? One perhaps is, yes, it might be overwhelmingly for one party versus the other, but it's still not a monolith. What motivates each diaspora member's interest attachment to India is going to be very different. There's going to be a generational divide. I think, US Civ Nuke, that experience allowed many to conclude that ultimately, if you're able to galvanize the diaspora is galvanized on its own. It was the first time that all these, what I call alphabet soup letter groups, came together toward a common cause, even if they didn't quite understand the technical components of the detail of the deal. They said, look, this is good for the relationship. The conclusion folks were drawing is ultimately, engaging the diaspora in this way will be beneficial to India. I wonder now if that's still the case, given that we have these generational divides, perhaps, given the fact that you have Indian American members that have arisen as some of the most vocal critics of India with respect to components of the domestic policy or whatever it may be, that, that idea is going to be re-examined, right? That the diaspora perhaps can play a role, they can perhaps be engaged, they can be cultivated, but there's going to be limits to just how far, and that goes both ways, I think, ultimately as well, moving down the line. And I think, ultimately, irrespective of who wins next week, you'll see more Indian Americans or South Asian Americans in positions of influence. And that's happened under every administration. And the way in this country that we are used to having our physician be of South Asian American descent, and we're used to having our engineer, having your public servant, your member of Congress, your federal judge, your local county official be of South Asian American heritage, that at some point will become unremarkable. And what implications that has for the conduct of foreign policy from the US to India and vice versa, I think has some interesting implications. But I'm again mindful that is a discussion for a whole other session amongst us. But I'm told that we are at time. I just want to give both of you 2 minutes to see if there's any wrap up that we want to do before we conclude. And again, just a final word from you both, if you do have one.
I want to give Ambassador Rao the final word. So I will just very quickly on this point also say that, there's also, I think analysts and scholars were surprised at the Indian government's response to some of the criticism, right, from members of Congress, because that criticism wasn't necessarily coming from no one was saying they don't want bad India-US relations. And so I think India and the government will also, I think, improve how it accepts or deals with that criticism, maybe behind closed doors, maybe, there isn't the need to dismiss or attack the people who criticize, because the critics can be friends also. And I think this is a very American thing also. Actually, that's true. That's a very Indian thing too. Everyone criticizes everybody, right? This is a universal democratic norm that criticism doesn't necessarily mean hostility, and that friends can criticize each other and do so from a good place. And so I think, improvements on both sides can be made in that regard, right? Both how to deliver it, but how to accept it. And, the US foreign policy and the US tends to be more self-critical on this regard, and is more open to it then also, right? We take criticism all the time. But, you know, I think that's something that going forward, this will be an issue also. And that, you know, friends can criticize each other and should and do, right? That's the sign of a true friendship. And I think that that's something also that shouldn't be forgotten in the relationship. So now I'll turn it over to Rao.
Yeah, thank you, Vipin. I completely agree with you. And I agree also that between friends, we should be able to deal with criticism. You talked of self-criticism, but I'm talking of criticism that one friend has to say against the other. I mean, we should be able to deal with it. We should be able to address those points of difference and to see how we can build a little more common ground. I think that is an ongoing process that we have to focus on. And since this, the Mittal Institute is about South Asia, one of the things that I have loved about seeing the way the diaspora functions in the United States is the way that friendships are made between South Asians, regardless of where they come from. And I've seen that in my personal experience. And I think that's one of the wonderful things about America and the way, you know, diasporas come together and where the way divides are bridged and where new identities are forged. And I think that's really what I see my vision for South Asia as being about, leaving out China, but talking about our own region. I said at the beginning that we're meant to be an integer, and maybe America shows us the way, which is the reason my South Asian Symphony Orchestra has so many Indian and South Asian Americans in it, and they've made such a difference. So I'd like to stop on that note.
Fantastic. Well, look, let me just once again thank you both so much for what's been a fascinating discussion. I know we could have all gone several hours longer and it still would not be enough time for all that we want to discuss and should be discussing, but perhaps we can convene sometime after the election and see how we did. But again, I just want to thank you both for everything that you do, for your service, and just being such important voices, you know, writ large on some of these issues. So thank you to you both. Thank you to the Mittal Institute for hosting and for organizing this. And of course, lastly, and perhaps most importantly, to those of you who have joined us in the middle of a day, depending on what part of the world you are, to be a part of this conversation as well. I know my information and Vipin's are available publicly. Reach out any time. If you have questions for the ambassador, we can get those to her as well. And we look forward to continuing the conversation down the line. Thank you to you both.
Thank you, Ronak. Thank you. Thank you,
Thank you, Ronak. Thank you, Vipin. Thank you, Chelsea. Thanks.